She bathed in blood to defy time. But in the end, it was time that peeled her soul apart. Behind the stone walls of Countess, rot festered not only in flesh, but in fate. A whisper echoes through the ancient stones of Countess castle, a whisper that stinks of old blood, rotted velvet, and decayed lineage. Beneath the tapestries embroidered with noble crests lies a truth too grotesque for courtly tongues. That Elizabeth Báthory, once resplendent in jewels and feared by kings, ended her life clawing at the darkness of her cell, with sores erupting on her skin, the scent of urine and rot haunting her every breath, and the cries of murdered girls echoing in her dreams. Tonight, we peel back the stone. We breathe the air of her prison, and we walk, step by step, through the agonizing, crumbling days of the Bloody Countess. She was born not into innocence, but into inheritance, the cold, silken cradle of aristocracy, where the cries of peasants were muffled by velvet curtains, and every birthright came with the stain of ancestral sins. The year was 1560, and in the frost-bitten corridors of near Báthory, beneath a ceiling embroidered with ancestral sigils and watchful gargoyles, Elizabeth Báthory drew her first breath into a world where cruelty and coronets walked hand in hand. Her bloodline, ancient and brittle with rot, pulsed with both privilege and poison, for her kin had ruled through fire and famine, through war and witchcraft, leaving in their wake legends not only of valor, but of madness, incest, and the devil's whisper behind closed chapel doors. Even as a girl, Elizabeth was different. She did not cry when others bled. She watched, still and silent, unblinking. Her nursemaid spoke in hushed tones of her staring into mirrors for hours, whispering in a tongue not quite her own. One claimed to have found her pulling the wings from a bird while softly reciting scripture in reverse, a tale dismissed by the Báthory elders as common peasant hysteria. But the rot had already taken root. By 16, she was wed to Ferenc Nadasdy, a marriage not of affection, but of empires colliding, sealed with ceremonial daggers and oaths spoken in the shadow of ancient cathedrals. He gifted her a castle, Countess, a fortress of stone and solitude nestled high in the Carpathians, where the fog clung to the walls like a curse, and the wolves howled not from hunger, but perhaps, some claimed, in mourning for what they sensed within. At first, she ruled as a noblewoman should, with grace, order, and iron. But over the years, something twisted beneath the silks and sapphire rings. Servants began to vanish, often young, always female. Peasants sent their daughters up the hill and received only silence, or coffins that smelled of vinegar and decay. They whispered of screams carried down the valley at dusk, of crimson trails in the snow too thick to be animal. And then came the rituals. Some say it began with a slap. A young handmaiden brushed Elizabeth's hair too roughly, and in rage, the Countess struck her. Blood spilled. A drop fell upon Elizabeth's pale skin. And whether by madness, hallucination, or the dark grace of delusion, she believed she saw her flesh grow younger, smoother, almost glowing beneath the smear. That night, a new ritual was born. One not taught by priests, but whispered by devils in dreams. She did not kill at first. She bled, a slice here, a pinprick there, enough to gather the essence in silver bowls, to anoint her face before sleep. But as time went on, restraint crumbled. Her chambers became sanctuaries of horror, veiled in curtains of burgundy that were never washed. Girls were chained upside down, their throats slit with gold knives, while Elizabeth stood beneath them, arms outstretched, laughing, a grotesque baptism in virgin blood. She surrounded herself with accomplices, old women twisted by greed, sycophantic servants who whispered encouragements in the darkness, and one priest who, it is said, absolved her with trembling hands in exchange for silence and coin. Together, they created a house of inverted prayers and sacred corruption. No crucifix was safe. Each one turned sideways, every relic desecrated, every mirror a portal to a face that refused to age. Yet Countess flourished, outwardly. The Countess remained untouchable, cloaked in the armor of nobility. Her lineage, her husband's battlefield glory, and her own cold intelligence protected her from consequence. Nobles visited, sipping wine in rooms where blood still clung to the floor beneath thick rugs. Priests blessed her halls, never asking what lay behind the locked doors or beneath the floorboards. But no fortress is immune to time, and no grave can hold so many daughters without weeping. By the turn of the century, whispers turned to accusations. By 1610, the corpses could no longer be hidden beneath soil or bribe. The rituals, once secret, now flickered in the nightmares of the village. And still, Elizabeth painted her face in blood, believing herself eternal, never seeing that the rot she had tried to escape had grown inside her long ago, devouring her soul cell by cell. She was not a queen, nor a monster, nor even a woman by the end. She was a vessel for decay disguised in velvet and teeth. A house built on blood. And blood, as history teaches us, always seeks the truth. By the first breaths of the 17th century, the very soil beneath Countess Castle had begun to whisper. Not with wind, but with warnings, with weeping, with the unsleeping sighs of bones buried shallow and in haste. What once had been murmurs spoken behind shaking hands in candlelit chapels now festered into letters inked in trembling strokes and smuggled across the frost-bitten plains of Hungary, until they landed, like blood-stained feathers, at the feet of power in Vienna. Yet it was not righteousness that stirred the court. The empire had always tolerated its monsters, so long as they wore silk and paid their tithes. No, it was envy. It was the widening shadow of a woman who owned more land than lords, who answered to no man, whose name, Báthory, could curdle the ambition of generals. Elizabeth's dominion had become too vast, too independent, and most of all, too loud. And so the hunters, long patient, began to sharpen their knives not with justice, but with hunger. What cracked the fortress was not confession, but betrayal, and it came not from strangers, but from within the very circle that had once fed her thirst. One maid, deformed from the waist down after surviving a punishment meant to maim, crawled to the village priest on a moonless night, her mouth foaming from fever and terror. She spoke of walls that bled, of girls dismembered for disobedience, of pale limbs stored like meat in underground cellars perfumed with lavender and lye. She spoke of screams stitched into the very stone of the bath chamber, of prayers uttered backward while Elizabeth anointed her cheeks with the blood of a child not yet old enough to name. And the priest, though white with fear, wrote every word, knowing, perhaps, that to keep it secret would be to join them in hell. Other stories followed, from stable boys, dismissed handmaids, travelers who had glimpsed too much and lived long enough to regret it. Their testimonies converged upon the image of a castle that had become a reliquary of suffering, its hearths cold with death, its corridors echoing with forgotten names. The news bled upward. The Habsburg court, its hunger disguised in holy rhetoric, began to move with the mechanical deliberation of a beast that has smelled the weakening of prey. They commissioned Count Georgi Thurso, a man both kin and vulture, to investigate, not as a seeker of truth, but as a hound set loose to retrieve what lands and titles the crown might yet swallow. He did not come with parchment and questions. He came with soldiers. On the 29th night of December, in the year 1610, the castle was broken open. The snow had fallen thick, muffling the approach of hooves and steel. Inside, the air was thick with scented oils, rose, myrrh, iron, and the low moan of a girl not quite dead. When the great doors shattered inward, the torchlight licked the walls like the tongues of judgment, revealing a vision of sanctified depravity. A girl hung by the wrists, her abdomen flayed open like a butchered lamb, intestines trailing like ribbons onto the stone. Another curled in a corner, skin blistered by boiling water, her eyes milky with shock. And Elizabeth stood in the center of the storm, not weeping, not pleading, but barefoot, lips parted in something between a smile and a spasm, her hands soaked to the elbows in blood that had not yet dried, her robe open as if she had been interrupted mid-ritual. She did not speak. She did not resist. She only tilted her head like one listening to a sound only she could hear. The final hymn of a god made of vanity, cruelty, and death. One soldier vomited at the sight. Another crossed himself repeatedly, whispering invocations to Saint Michael as if the devil himself had bloomed in female flesh before him. In the days that followed, they tore apart her sanctuary. Beneath her bed, they found teeth. In her private garden, bones bloomed where flowers should have grown. In the wine cellars, girls' bodies, some rotting, some freshly slain, were packed in barrels like pickled game. Her accomplices, once loyal, now squealed like rats under flame, describing ceremonies of darkness, of chants in forgotten dialects, of infants dismembered and burned to purify the air before Elizabeth bathed. And yet, no formal trial ever came. She was a noble. To drag her into the courts would be to stain the entire Hungarian aristocracy with her sins. Instead, they wrote history with mortar and stone, sealing her alive within her own chamber, turning her prison into her epitaph. But in that moment, when the soldiers first laid eyes upon her, bloodied, barefoot, beatific in madness, the veil was lifted. The priestess of blood had been unmasked, and the empire, which had fed upon her horror for decades, now recoiled from its own reflection. Her reign had not ended with rebellion or sword. It had ended, as all things do that defy the laws of nature, with rot, silence, and the hungry eyes of men who had waited too long to feast. The punishment was not execution, it was erasure. For to raise the blade against her would have meant confessing that noble blood could be tainted, that the sins of the empire were not confined to the peasantry, but festered in the very veins of its lords. And so, in the dead of winter, in the earliest months of the year 1611, Elizabeth Báthory, once adorned in rubies and silk, once feared as both countess and carrion crow, was led not to the gallows, but to a burial within her own walls. Her chamber, once a sanctuary of oil lamps, perfume, and muffled cries, was sealed brick by brick, the mortar still wet as the final stone was placed. No priest blessed the door. No crucifix was nailed above the arch. Just a narrow slit carved in the cold wall, through which light never passed. Only the rank breath of airless decay and the occasional crust of bread, so hard it split her gums, and a cup of sour wine that smelled faintly of rust and old teeth. Within that stone womb, time ceased to move in a straight line. The first days she sat upright, wrapped in furs, composing furious speeches to no audience, still certain this was a mistake, a gesture, a punishment meant to frighten, that her cousin Thurzo would arrive with a scroll of pardon, that the walls would open like a stage curtain, revealing her redemption. But the days did not end. The walls did not speak, and the furs, once perfumed with lavender and civet, turned damp and mold-speckled, heavy with urine and fear. Her skin, once the object of ritual and obsession, alabaster, polished by the blood of girls, betrayed her first. It blistered and cracked, the cold drawing blood to the surface, then freezing it into scabs that turned black with rot. The ulcers came next, slow, weeping wounds that oozed a yellow fluid onto the straw beneath her, attracting flies that buzzed like choirs of mockery in the darkness. They laid their eggs in her open sores, and within days, maggots wriggled beneath her nightgown, a parasitic baptism that chewed her flesh while she slept. Sleep. What a word. She did not sleep, not in any sense that offered rest. She drifted into fevered hallucinations, into pockets of time where the walls pulsed with breath and the floor bled beneath her. She would awaken with her hands raw and bleeding, having clawed at the stone, convinced there was a door beneath the moss, a hidden stair, a way out that only the dead could see. Her nails split, her knuckles swelled. The pain, at first sharp, became dull, then constant, then holy. And then came the girls. They did not arrive through the slit in the wall. They came from the corners, the cracks in her vision. Pale things with no eyes, their mouths stitched shut, their throats still open from the blade. They crawled on all fours, dragging broken limbs, their fingers leaving trails of black on the stone. And when they sang, it was not in words, but in noises, lullabies twisted into animal howls, prayers played backward through broken mouths. One sat on her chest each night, whispering nothings into her ear, licking the pus from her wounds with a tongue too long, too warm. And Elizabeth wept, not because of guilt. That part of her had long withered, if it had ever bloomed at all. No, she wept because she was no longer beautiful, because she had no mirror, because even if she did, The thing staring back would not be her, not the Countess of Blood, not the woman who had once danced through candlelight soaked in the fluids of the young and innocent. She wept for the vanity that had kept her human, for the perfume that had once masked the stench now rising from her own crotch like a curse. The chamber became a tomb, not symbolic but actual. Rats chewed through the stone to reach the rot. Mold bloomed on her food before she could touch it. Her chamber pot overflowed onto the floor, soaking into the straw, mixing with blood and bile until the air thickened, congealed, and turned her breath into coughs that rattled through her ribs like broken bells. And yet, the worst punishment was the sound of footsteps that never stopped, echoing on the floor above, pacing, as though the world still moved on without her. She heard laughter once, real or imagined, and screamed until her throat bled, until the stone walls seemed to close in and whisper, "They have forgotten you." There were no priests now, no final sacrament, no confession, only the memory of a god she had once feared, then mocked, then tried to become. Now she prayed to that god again, but her words dissolved in her mouth like rotting teeth, unanswered, unheard. And still, the maggots danced. They were the only ones who still touched her. In the suffocating dark of her tomb, where time dissolved like bone in lye and air thickened with the stench of decaying meat, Elizabeth Báthory's mind, once sharp enough to command estates and orchestrate nightmares, unraveled like damp silk, thread by thread, until it no longer knew the difference between memory, punishment, and dream. Desperate, she began to pray again, to any god, old or new, righteous or vile. She scratched crude crosses into the stone using pieces of her own ribs, which had broken beneath her when she fell and were never set. She bled from the knuckles, smeared herself in a mixture of old wine and pus, whispering apologies in fragments of scripture and demonic rhyme, tongues so twisted by fever that even hell would not recognize them. But heaven was silent. No dove came, no light broke through the slit in the stone, no absolution arrived, only a knock. One afternoon, or was it night, the slot opened wider than usual, and a figure stepped into her cell. A priest, pale as death, shaking behind his collar, eyes darting to avoid meeting hers. He carried no candle, only a book, already damp from the breath of the place. He recited blessings through gritted teeth, the Latin weak and stammered, the fear in his voice strong enough to sour the air. She laughed at him, a dry, rattling bark that ended in a coughing fit thick with blood and something that looked like jellyfish flesh. And then she begged, not for mercy, not for salvation, but for beauty. "They took my mirrors," she rasped, her voice no longer human but gravel wrapped in rot. "I don't remember my face. Please, bring me a mirror. I'll confess. I'll tell you where the bodies are. I'll name the ones who helped me. Just let me see her again. The girl I was." The priest dropped his book. It landed in a puddle. He fled. They say he never spoke again, and Elizabeth was left alone with her court, the only judges who had ever dared look upon her without flinching. They came back that night, louder now, closer, their wings brushing her sagging flesh. One knelt beside her, jaw dislocated, whispering a lullaby through broken teeth, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall." And Elizabeth screamed until her throat tore open and her voice fled her like the last of her youth. It came not with a scream, nor with the theatrical collapse one might expect from a woman who had once commanded death like a sovereign right. No, it came with stillness, with the sickening weight of absence that settled over Chakteet's castle on the 21st night of August, in the year 1614, like a funeral shroud made not of cloth, but of silence so complete it choked the breath of every man who dared walk its halls. For 3 years she had groaned, cursed, whimpered, and chattered with phantoms in the dark, a dissonant liturgy of madness that leaked through the cracks like steam from a rot-swollen corpse. The jailer, a man hardened by war but broken by this duty, had grown used to the ritual, the rattle of bones against stone, the gasping half-laughs that rose at dusk, the nocturnal sermons whispered to gods unknown. It had become background noise, a vile symphony that reassured him, paradoxically, that she still lived, that the beast in the wall still breathed. But that night, that final, fetid night, there was nothing. Not even the flies buzzed. The jailer stood outside her sealed door, torch trembling in hand, listening for any sign, a cough, a curse, a clawing, but was met only with a quiet so dense it seemed to press against his chest like a stone slab. He called her name, not out of concern, but out of dread. Nothing answered, not even the echo of his own voice. When he dared open the small iron slit in the wall, a rectangle barely large enough for bread to pass through, the torchlight wavered, then steadied upon a tableau more grotesque than any vision of hell his mother's Bible had ever warned of. She was collapsed in the far corner, twisted into a posture that no living body could hold without snapping. Her legs, bloated and green, were bent at grotesque angles, the ankles curling inward like a puppet's strings had been cut. Her arms were stretched above her head, as if she had reached toward something in her last moment. Salvation, perhaps, or one final hallucination. Before gravity took her and the floor welcomed its queen with the indifference of stone. Her skin was no longer skin. It was parchment, bloated where the flesh had fermented, taut where it had collapsed, bursting in places where worms had taken residence, their slick white bodies wriggling in ecstasy with the banquet of a soul devoured slowly, cell by cell. The jailer did not scream. He merely stepped back, crossed himself with a hand that trembled like a fevered limb, and muttered the Lord's Prayer in reverse. Not from piety, but from some ancient peasant superstition that such words might hold back the rot that now radiated from behind the stone like a curse unchained. There was no priest summoned. No bell rang. No herald bore the news to Vienna. Her death was not a state affair. It was a secret, a stain, a crack in the marble of nobility that must be sealed before it festered further. Her body, half consumed by vermin and decomposition, was shoveled into a nameless grave beneath the courtyard at dawn. The men who performed the task vomiting into their own sleeves, eyes red not from grief but from the sulfuric stench that clung to her bones. No hymns were sung. No soul was commended to God. Instead, her name was struck from the family records, scraped from the stained glass windows she had once commissioned, burned from ledgers that tracked the land she had once ruled with an iron hand and a bloody smile. Even portraits were slashed and buried, lest her gaze linger too long and call forth the girls once more. And so, Chakets fell silent. The castle, once alive with screaming and velvet, feasting and flaying, became a husk. Shepherds refused to graze their flocks nearby. Priests crossed themselves when its towers came into view. Locals told stories of the air turning cold near the walls, of faint sobs heard beneath the earth, of blood oozing from stone during the red moons of autumn. They say the wind still carries her voice, not words, but breath, ragged and rasping, begging for a mirror, for her face, for something to reflect back the woman she once was before time devoured her and left only bones and memory. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when even the wolves do not howl, they say the walls bleed. The villagers of Chakets, long after the towers fell and the blood dried, would still walk wide circles around the ruins. Mothers warned their daughters never to look too long at the castle windows, for fear they'd glimpse something looking back. Shepherds refused to bring their flocks near the outer walls. They said the stones wept red when the moon turned its face. They said the flies still came in summer, in numbers no crop of cattle could explain. And they said, in whispers, that sometimes, if you stood near the sealed chamber door, you could hear breathing. But the loudest voice, the one that never ceased, was history itself. Not the kind written by scholars with quills and gold-trimmed books, but the kind that lingers in nightmares and firelight, in the sudden shiver on a warm night, in the silence between prayers, in the hush that falls over a child when the wind hisses just right. For Elizabeth Báthory ruled not an empire of borders, nor of kings, but of flesh. Her dominion was measured in veins and screams, in bruises and virgin blood, in the shivering bodies of the powerless. And that empire, vile, secret, fed on the marrow of the young, did not collapse. It curdled, and from its rot grew a legend too monstrous to forget. In the end, she was not remembered as a woman, not even as a monster, but as a symbol, a mirror shattered by hubris, a crown rusted by cruelty, a soul hollowed out by the gluttony of youth denied by time. She chased immortality in the warmth of blood, and what she found instead was the cold, endless weight of a history that never dies, because we will not let it. Because even now, centuries later, we need her, as a warning, as a shadow, as proof that beneath every empire, no matter how golden, lies a tomb waiting to be sealed.